In September 1898, Nikolai Volkov spent 2 weeks digging a hole that went nowhere. His neighbors called him a lunatic and bet gold on his failure. But when the temperature hit minus 50 degrees, that useless hole became the only thing standing between his family and freezing to death. Kayakuk River Valley, Alaska, September 1898. While every prospector and homesteader in the territory was racing to finish walls and roofs before the killing frost arrived, Nikolai Volkov was digging a hole that went nowhere. The 34-year-old Russian immigrant had spent 2 weeks excavating a trench 3 feet deep around the entire perimeter of his cabin foundation. It was a ditch that connected to nothing, drained nothing, and served no purpose anyone in the mining camp could identify. The Russian has lost his mind, one neighbor announced at the trading post, shaking snow from his parka. He's digging his own moat like some kind of medieval fool. But Nikolai wasn't building a moat. And if you want to understand why his children slept barefoot, while his neighbors' children lost toes to frostbite inside their own homes, you have to understand where he came from. Nikolai Volkov had arrived in Alaska in the spring of 1896, part of a wave of immigrants lured by rumors of gold and the promise of land. He had left behind a village in Yakutia, the coldest inhabited region of Siberia, where his family had survived winters that froze mercury solid. He brought with him his wife, Elena, their 3 young children, and a trunk containing tools and knowledge he hoped would translate to this frozen new world. The first winter in Alaska nearly broke him. The rough log shack he'd thrown together in autumn 1896 was a disaster. The walls wept moisture, the roof groaned under weight of snow, and the floor of packed earth turned to a sheet of ice by December. His children slept in fur boots because the cold radiating up from the frozen permafrost numbed feet within minutes. Elena developed a cough that rattled in her chest until May, her lungs never fully warming in a home where breath crystallized 3 feet from the stove. But it was the floor that haunted Nikolai most. He'd watched his children's toes turn white, then red, then develop the blisters of frostbite despite never leaving the cabin. The cold came from below, up through the earth, through the packed dirt floor, through the thin layer of spruce boughs they'd spread as insulation. The ground itself was the enemy, frozen solid to a depth that seemed infinite, conducting cold into the cabin like a river of ice flowing upward. In Yakutia, the winters were harsh, but the construction was different. His grandfather's home had foundations designed to handle the permafrost, creating a separation between the living space and the frozen earth. Alaska offered no such infrastructure. The river valley was silt and clay over rock-hard permafrost. Building a proper raised foundation would require materials no homesteader could afford or transport. So, settlers built directly on the ground and accepted frozen floors as the price of frontier life. Nikolai refused to accept it. Through the summer of 1897, while panning for dust and clearing land, he thought about the problem. The ground froze from the surface downward as winter cold penetrated the soil. By January, the frost created a massive thermal reservoir of frozen earth that pressed against cabin foundations, stealing heat relentlessly. The solution, he realized, wasn't to insulate against the cold ground. It was to prevent the ground under the house from freezing in the first place. In Yakutia, herders use a technique called a warm trench around cattle sheds to keep the livestock from freezing. A ditch filled with organic material, straw, moss, dry peat, created a buffer zone where trapped air prevented frost penetration. The shed surrounded by these trenches stayed warmer than the ambient ground. What worked for cattle might work for a cabin. If Nikolai could create a thermal break around his foundation, a ring of insulation, he might keep the ground under his cabin from ever freezing at all. That by September 1898, he'd built a proper cabin on a new site. The walls were solid, the roof tight, the moss chinking carefully applied. But before he moved his family inside, he had one more task to complete. He picked up his shovel and started digging. The trench measured 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide, running in a complete rectangle around a cabin foundation with no gaps. Nikolai dug alone, carving to the dense Alaskan soil that grew heavier as he descended. His nearest neighbor, a hardened American prospector named Silas Thorne, who had staked the adjacent claim, noticed the excavation on the 3rd day. Thorne had survived 3 Yukon winters and considered himself an authority on survival. He hiked over with genuine concern on his weathered face. "Volkov, what in God's name are you digging there?" Nikolai's English was rough but functional. He explained the concept: the thermal break, the insulation layer, the prevention of frost penetration beneath the cabin floor. Thorne listened with the expression of a man humoring a lunatic. "You're digging a ditch to keep the ground from freezing," Thorne repeated slowly. "And you're going to fill it with dry grass and moss? Anything that holds air." Thorne removed his fur hat and scratched his head. "The ground freezes 6 feet deep here, Russian. Your little trench won't stop that. The frost will go right under it and come up through your floor same as everyone else's. Frost travels through soil, not through air." Nikolai pointed at the cabin. "Ground under my floor stays unfrozen. Floor stays warm. Children keep their toes." Thorne shook his head with something between pity and frustration. "I've seen Chichakos try strange things out here. Most of them are dead by spring." He gathered his reins. "You're wasting 2 weeks of labor before winter. That time should be spent cutting firewood, not digging ditches to nowhere." Word spread quickly through the small mining settlements scattered along the river. The Russian was digging a moat. The Russian thought he could stop the Alaskan winter. The Russian was going to kill his family with foreign foolishness. At the trading post, miners gathered around the potbelly stove and shared their assessments. A Swedish miner declared that the trench would fill with water, freeze solid, and crack the foundation. An old trapper said he'd seen many immigrants try clever tricks, and the North always won. Silas Thorne offered an ounce of gold dust to anyone who'd take the bet that the Volkov cabin would be abandoned by February. The women in the settlement organized their own intervention. 2 wives trekked to the Volkov homestead on a Saturday afternoon, finding Elena hanging laundry while her husband continued digging his incomprehensible trench. "Mrs. Volkov, we're worried about your children," announced Martha Thorne, Silas's wife. "Winter is coming. The little ones need firewood stacked, not ditches dug." Elena had learned enough English to understand the condescension beneath the concern. "My husband knows what he builds. In Siberia, we survive winters that would freeze your blood." Martha sighed. "This isn't Siberia, dear. This is Alaska. The cold here is different." Elena returned to her laundry. "Cold is cold. Physics is physics. Come back in January. See whose children still have all their toes." The wives retreated, offended by the immigrant woman's stubbornness. By evening, the story had spread. The Russians thought they knew better than people who'd survived the Klondike for years. Pride like that got families killed. Nikolai finished his trench on September 28th. Now came the filling. What Nikolai Volkov understood from generations of Yakutian knowledge, modern soil science would later confirm. The key was understanding how frost penetrates soil. Cold travels downward from a frozen surface through conduction. Soil particles touch other soil particles, and heat energy transfers until equilibrium is reached. In Alaska, where temperatures regularly drop to -40 degrees, this conduction drove frost deep. But conduction requires contact. Break the chain of touching particles, and heat transfer slows dramatically. Air is a terrible conductor. It transfers heat roughly 25 times slower than soil. A pocket of trapped air acts like a thermal wall. Nikolai's trench created exactly this break, 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide, filled with loose dry grass, moss, and leaves. The ditch surrounded his foundation with continuous barrier of trapped air pockets. Frost advancing horizontally would hit this barrier and slow dramatically. Instead of conducting directly into the soil beneath his cabin, the cold would have to travel around or under the trench, a much longer path. The depth mattered critically. Even if the frost line went deeper, the trench would block the initial, most severe penetration. The filling material mattered, too. Dry grass and tundra moss contain millions of tiny air pockets between their fibers. Packed loosely, these materials maintain their insulating properties even under the weight of snow. There was another principle at work that Nikolai understood intuitively. The ground beneath an occupied cabin wasn't simply cold soil. It was soil that received heat from above. Every bit of heat that escaped to the cabin floor warmed the earth directly below in a normal cabin. This heat bled away horizontally into the vast frozen mass surrounding the foundation. but with an insulating trench creating a thermal break. That escaping heat accumulated in the soil beneath the floor. Nikolai was essentially creating an underground thermal battery. The trench didn't need to stop all frost. It only needed to slow it enough that the heat escaping from the cabin could keep pace, maintaining the soil temperature above freezing. His neighbor saw a pointless ditch filled with weeds. Nikolai saw a thermal envelope. The materials cost nothing, waste from the forest. The labor cost 2 weeks of digging. The return would be measured in toes that didn't blacken. The filling process began on the first day of October. Nikolai had gathered cartloads of dry blue joint grass and dried sphagnum moss. He started at the northeast corner, working methodically. The first layer was coarse branches to keep the grass off the bottom. Then came the thick bundles of grass and moss, tamped lightly to prevent settling while maintaining air pockets. Elena joined him for the upper layers, passing bundles down. The children helped by carrying moss in canvas sacks. By the 5th day, the trench was filled to within 6 inches of ground level. Nikolai topped it with a thick layer of soil to protect the organic material from wind and sparks. The final step was a shallow drainage channel leading downhill, ensuring spring meltwater wouldn't saturate the insulation. Wet grass conducted heat, dry grass resisted it. Total cost, $0. Total labor, 21 days. Days, as neighbors insisted, should have been spent cutting firewood. Nikolai had cut firewood too, but only half of what Silas Thorne had stacked. The neighbors noticed and added it to their catalog of Russian foolishness. On October 20th, the first hard frost turned the willows silver. Nikolai walked the perimeter, checking for settling. Everything looked solid. That night, he knelt beside his children's bed and placed his palm flat on the cabin floor. The wood was cool, but not cold. The soil beneath hadn't frozen yet. Elena found him there. Well, she asked, we'll know in January. Nikolai looked at his sleeping children. I'm not wrong. The ground will stay warm. November brought the darkness and the true cold. Temperatures dropped to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. By December, Nikolai's trench had become the favorite joke at the mining camp. Silas Thorne appointed himself the chronicler of the expected failure, reporting weekly on the Volkov family's apparent delusion. I give them until Christmas, Thorne announced. The wife will drag those kids to town begging for shelter. The betting pool grew to 5 ounces of gold. No one bet on success. The women's concern curdled into exclusion. Martha Thorne no longer visited. They shunned Elena, and the Volkov boys found themselves mocked by other children who called them moat boys and ditch diggers. Elena confronted Nikolai one evening after the boys came home with bruised faces. They are suffering for your trench, she said tightly. They suffered more from frozen feet, Nikolai replied. Physics doesn't change because we cross an ocean. December brought the hammer blow. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees, then minus 40 degrees. The ground froze hard, frost penetrating deeper every day. Neighbors reported floors turning to ice, water buckets freezing indoors, and a constant battle to keep stoves roaring. Nikolai checked his floor daily. Cool, yes, but not frozen. On December 23rd, Silas Thorne rode past and saw thin smoke rising from Nikolai's chimney. Not the desperate plume of a family burning everything to survive. He shook his head. January would settle it. January 1899 descended on the Yukon with murderous intent. A blizzard buried the valley, and temperatures bottomed out at minus 50 degrees. The wind howled for days. The Thorne cabin became a battleground. Silas fed his stove every hour, yet his floor remained frigid enough to freeze spit. His children huddled on raised bunks, wrapped in furs, but the cold radiating from the ground was relentless. Martha Thorne developed frostbite on her heels while cooking. The floor temperature near their walls dropped below zero. Across the settlement, the pattern repeated. Homesteaders burned through firewood at terrifying rates. Children's feet blackened. At the Volkov homestead, however, January passed differently. Nikolai built his morning fire, let it die to coals by midday, and rebuilt it in the evening. The floor remained cool, but never cold. The children walked barefoot in the morning. Even when the outside air hit minus 50 degrees, the soil beneath the cabin, protected by the trench, never froze. Heat escaping from the cabin was trapped in the earth below, radiating back up. On January 26th, the peak of the cold snap, Nikolai found the floor was actually warmer than the air in the room at dawn. That same night, Silas Thorne's youngest son woke screaming. His feet had turned white and waxy while he slept, frostbitten through wool socks. Silas spent the night warming the boy's feet against his own skin, watching the flesh turn angry red. The boy would lose a toe. The memory of his scream would haunt Silas forever. Silas Thorne appeared at the Volkov homestead on February 3rd. He didn't come with mockery. He came with questions. Nikolai met him at the door. Silas stepped inside and froze, confused. The air was warm, but the floor, he could feel the difference. "Your floor," Silas said. "It's not frozen." Nikolai knelt. "Feel." Silas pressed his hand to the wood. It was perhaps 45 degrees. "Impossible. The ground is frozen 6 feet down." "Not here." Nikolai led him outside to the snow-covered trench. He dug down through the cap to the dry grass beneath. "Feel this." Silas reached in. The grass was dry and noticeably warmer than the surrounding soil. "The trench stops the frost," Nikolai explained. "Cold moves by contact. Break the contact. Cold cannot pass." He showed Silas his logbook. Floor temperature in Volkov cabin, 44 degrees. Floor temperature in Thorne's cabin, 15 degrees. Nikolai had burned half the wood Silas had. "The floor steals the heat," Nikolai said. "My floor gives it back." Silas stood in the snow, looking at the simple technology that had saved the Volkov children while his own son suffered. "Grass," he whispered. "Just grass in a ditch." "And air," Nikolai added. "Simple physics." Silas looked at him, the weight of his arrogance crushing him. "Why didn't you explain?" "I tried. You laughed. You bet gold on my failure." Silas had no response. "Teach me," he finally said. "Please." Silas Thorne returned the next day with a pickaxe. He didn't wait for spring. He started chipping away at the frozen iron-hard ground around his cabin while his wife watched with exhausted hope. Word of Thorne's conversion spread faster than the ridicule had. The man who had led the skeptics was now digging a ditch in February. By March, for families were digging trenches. Nikolai supervised, ensuring they used dry materials and capped them correctly. When the spring thaw came, the work began in earnest. Silas Thorne finished his trench in May. 21 days of labor, Silas told Nikolai. "I spent 21 days mocking you. My son would still have his toe if I had listened." By the autumn of 1899, every occupied cabin in the settlement had a thermal trench. The technique spread down the Yukon River, carried by trappers and prospectors who heard the story of the Russian and his magical moat. The winter of 1899 to 1900 was even colder, but not a single child in the settlement lost a toe. The betting pool money was used to buy supplies for a widow. Silas Thorne became the technique's loudest advocate, traveling to new camps to teach the method he had once scorned. He always told the same story: how he had laughed at the Russian and how his arrogance had cost his son a toe. Nikolai Volkov never asked for credit. The warm floors were enough. His children still had all their toes, and now, so would everyone else's.